if you want to influence people's opinions, decisions, and behavior, you need to influence both parts of the brain. But we typically, like you said, only talk to that rational, logical thinking part of the brain, and you need to reach both. And storytelling is just uniquely suited to reach the subconscious emotional processing part of the brain, whereas a list of rational and logical facts and arguments and data just don't.
5, 4, 3, 2, 1. 40 seconds, and we're going.
Never in the field of human conflict.
How do you measure such an astonishing moment in history?
You're listening to the bigQUEST podcast with Andy Murray. In a high-stakes, unpredictable world, every day is ripe with blue ocean adventures just waiting to be discovered. You need the mindset, the methods, and the motivation to lead with confidence into the unknown. Come along as we talk to today's top leaders, known for simplifying challenges, outsmarting variables, and inspiring greatness. Welcome to the bigQUEST podcast. How are you doing, Andy?
Hey, Ben. It's great to see you today. I'm really excited about what we're going to cover.
Well, today we're talking with Paul Smith, the best-selling author of Lead with a Story. Paul is a business storytelling coach, and Inc. magazine named him one of the top 100 leadership speakers in 2018. But the main reason we're talking to Paul is because stories play a significant role in any quest that's engaging and inspiring.
Yeah, that's right, Ben. They really do. And I think Paul has a great story for sure. And I've known Paul back when he was still at Procter Gamble and was weighing, do I leave P&G and start something new or not? And so I think his story alone is very interesting. And it is a big quest to leave the corporate world with a perfectly good job at doing well and then jump into an entrepreneurial space. Takes a lot of courage. But he's been fun to watch. And not only does he have great insights into the power story, but his own story is quite fascinating too. So let's listen in. Hey, Paul, how are you doing today? It's great to see you.
Hey, great, Andy. Thanks for having me on.
You know, many people don't know this, or probably no one does really, but you and I go way back to when you were working at Procter Gamble.
Yeah, I'm afraid to say how many years that was, but it's been a while. Although I think we didn't quite overlap. You had already gone off and founded Saatchi, what became Saatchi and Saatchi X, right? Thomson Murray, I think. I think you'd already left to do that by the time I got on the team. But your legend lived on there, and we got to cross paths a little bit before you moved on to other things.
So last time that you and I talked, you were still at P&G and working on this idea of storytelling. And then the next thing I know, I'm off at Walmart, I think, and you've left P&G and took the leap. So I'd love to know what decision-making process you went through to take and leave a perfectly good job like Procter.
Yeah, it was a perfectly good job. And I had a fair number of people tell me how crazy I was. I think I was in my mid-40s at the time and, wife and kids at home. So too young to retire and all that. So it took a lot of thinking and planning. In fact, it was a 2-year-long process. But the gist of it was, my personal philosophy with careers is that most of us love like 10% of our job. That's the reason why we joined that company to begin with, or went into that line of work to begin with. And most of us probably hate 10% of our job, whether it's office politics or filling out your expense report. But the big bulk in the middle, the 80% of the job in the middle, I think most of us think, hey, it's decent work. I mean, I wouldn't do it if you didn't pay me, but it's good work. And I thought, wouldn't it be cool if I could just do that 10% at the top, that 10% that I absolutely love? And it took me a while to figure out what that was, but I started to actively think about what would be my 10%. And for me, it was the few days a year that I got to either give a speech at the company annual meeting, or teach a new hire training class, or teach a new general manager, university within the company or something. So essentially what I loved to do was to teach. I don't mean in school, but professionals. And it turned out there was not a single job at Procter Gamble, you remember this, that had that job. 120,000 people, and not one person had that full-time job. It just didn't exist. So I started to look around and see, well, who gets to do that full-time? And it turns out the only people that get to do that full-time are people somebody who's written a best-selling book, and then they travel around the world talking about whatever it is that they wrote about in the book. And so I thought, well, I guess I got to write a book. And so that literally it was that intentional. It wasn't that I just had this book in me that I had to get out. It was, I want to change careers. And that appears to be the path to changing careers. And so I spent probably 18 months researching and writing about the topic of storytelling. And I picked that because it was the thing that I was the most passionate about. And then waited another 6 or 8 or 12 months, to go through the publishing process. And so it was a good 2-year process of making that decision and going through with it before I actually had a book on the shelf. And by the way, I did all that while I was still at P&G. So I still hadn't made the decision to leave, but I was laying the groundwork for that. The decision to leave is another one. If you want to hear that, I've got some pretty specific criteria for how I got there.
Well, I would, but it's interesting. When I left P&G after 9 years and went to a smaller company, much smaller, I remember having a conversation with my dad, who said, "Are you sure you really want to do that? I mean, in Cincinnati, that's P&G is a big company. And you almost felt like there was a lifetime guaranteed employment, so it wasn't something that he was jumping up and down about." How did you finally work up the courage to go through with it?
Yeah, well, it was also a conversation with my dad. And I expected him to either tell me what yours told you, or he was going to tell me, I know you can do it, son. I've got, he's going to be my cheerleader and cheer me on and have me go. But he didn't do either of those things. He literally wrote me a letter because he was 80 years old and hard of hearing, so I couldn't talk to him on the phone anymore. He wrote me a letter and he told me a story about himself that he'd never told me before, never told any of my siblings. He said, when I was 5 years old, I knew exactly what I wanted to do with my life. He said, I wanted to be a singer, like Frank Sinatra or Tony Bennett or Sammy Davis Jr., right? He's 80, so that was his genre. And he said, I knew that for sure, the first day of first grade there, when the teacher asked all the students if anybody had any special talents, like dancing or magic tricks or something. And he said, I raised my hand and I said, I can sing. Well, Andy, I'll just ask you, what do you think a good teacher would do if, little 5-year-old Bobby says that he can sing?
Can you sing me a song?
Absolutely. Well, Bobby, just sing us a song. So little 5-year-old Bobby Smith stands up and he belts out his favorite song right there in front of the teacher and the other students. And he said in this letter to me, he said, when I got finished, or by the way, he said, I nailed it, right? I got all the words right, all the melody and everything. He was so proud. And he said, the teacher and the other students stood up and they applauded me. He said, I got a standing ovation my first time to sing in front of an audience, right? Because he'd never sang in front of anybody but his mom in the kitchen before. He's 5, right? And he said in this letter, he went on to say, unfortunately, that turned out not just to be the first time in my life that I ever sang in front of an audience. It turned out to be the last time that I ever sang in front of an audience. And he said, the truth is, son, I just never had the courage to go through with it, and he said, that's been 75 years. And in that 75 years, there's not been a month that's gone by that I haven't regretted that decision. And he said, someday you're going to be 80 years old like me, and it's going to be too late to pursue your dream. And honestly, as if that wasn't enough, and it was, by the way, I kid you not, he ended this letter with these words. He said, I'd love to see you achieve your dream, but that doesn't mean in your lifetime, son. That means in mine. And wow. Gosh, I just thought, TikTok, the guy's 80, right? I mean, I don't have all day to work on.
You're a writer. I mean, that's like great writing. What a writer.
Yeah. So I literally, Andy, 2 days later, I walk into my boss's office and I resigned, from my 20-year career. And, I would not have done it that soon had it not been for that letter.
Yeah, that is a great story. And now I understand why storytelling so important to you. I mean, it's something that you've really had a bit of your heritage. I'm sure that's not the only great story he's told you.
It's not, but yeah, so I come by it honestly.
No, that's awesome. Paul, one of the things that I think people get a little confused on, or maybe they just gloss over because it's such a familiar word and they just, jump through it. And that is the word story itself. And so when you talk about storytelling, what do you mean by story, and what can be a story? Is it a metaphor, or just put some context around when you're talking about story? What do you mean?
Yeah, thank you. Great question, because that word can mean a lot of things to a lot of people, and my definition is mine. But when I teach people about storytelling, what I mean by story is a narrative about something interesting that happened to someone. So other people will use that word to mean all kinds of things like, our marketing strategy tells a story, our mission statement tells a story, our brand logo tells a story. And, maybe they do, but probably not. Probably it's just it could be a great mission statement, a great, marketing plan. It could be a fabulous logo. It doesn't necessarily have to tell a story. It will have a message, and brands have equities, but a brand equity and a story, in my definition, are not the same thing. A story is a narrative about something that happened to someone, something interesting that happened to somebody. So as such, it'll have a time, a place, a main character. That main character will be, facing some kind of a challenge. They'll have a goal, and there'll be an obstacle getting in the way of that goal. And there'll be events that transpire along the way that hopefully resolve themselves, in the end in either a success or a failure. But that's what a story is. You ask any 10-year-old kid, that's what they mean by a story. And that's what I mean by a story as well.
Yeah. Versus just clever copy or great messaging. You're talking about something that illustrates a problem and how that problem was overcome in some ways, right?
Exactly.
Yes, that's great. Well, one of the things that we're working on with bigQUEST is making sure that when you get to that moment where you need to start creating buy-in and moving forward on something that may not be well known because you're really moving a bit more into blue ocean spaces, that you need to think through how you tell that story and often use a story to make it relevant. And as you look at stories, because I know you've looked at all kinds of stories that leaders tell, we'll get into that, but I'm curious on the stories that you may have heard in the development of your brand and the books and stuff that you've written that relate to convincing someone to leap into something new, to create buy-in, or how to get someone over a barrier. Are there any stories or ideas around how you might do that you'd be willing to share or have available to share?
Yeah, so I think the kind of story you're talking about, I would probably refer to as a case for change story. So it's a story that gives people the emotional motivation to leave their comfort zone of what they're doing now to do something different. And those stories are typically stories about someone, could be yourself, could be somebody else, that has a problem, right? There's something wrong now, and you need the audience to see that and feel that problem, that human suffering, if you will, even if it's not, terrible life-threatening suffering, but some kind of suffering that would motivate them to help create a change. So the example in my last book in that chapter on Case for Change stories is about a 10-year-old boy named Joey who had a rare form of kidney cancer in kids. And he, unfortunately, there was no cure for it at the time. And of course, that's a terrible, suffering that you go through with that. The whole family has to suffer through it with him. And the mom in this case, tried everything to, get all the doctors to help, find a cure for her kid. And eventually Merck Pharmaceuticals came up with a new drug to treat this. It's a class of drugs called a PD-1 inhibitor. It's called Keytruda. And it was developed exactly for this kind of cancer. And she ended up having to lobby them to get it to be used before it was ready. Kind of these emergency use authorizations like we're seeing right now with, COVID vaccines. But anyway, she eventually got an approval to use it on her son. And, 3 or 4 weeks into the process, he ended up dying, unfortunately, because he just didn't get it soon enough. If he'd gotten it months earlier, he might have survived. And that story, I share that because that story, a pharmaceutical company, not Merck, a different one, hired me to help them with their Case for Change story. And they ended up choosing that one that they had heard on a local NPR radio station. And I find that fascinating because notice that wasn't their product and that wasn't their customer. But they chose that story because it illustrated the value of getting their products, their life-saving products, to market sooner, because they were trying to reduce their drug development time from 15 years to 5 years or something. And telling people what the NPV is or how much more money they're going to make just didn't motivate the employees very much. But telling them stories about kids like Joey, whose life could have been saved if they'd gotten the drugs to market sooner, was motivating. So that's a case for change story. And not all of them are going to be about, curing cancer. It doesn't have to be that dramatic, but that's an example of one.
What is it about us as people where we're more persuaded by a story that may or may not be true? Most likely it could be, probably, and it was in this case, but you put story over here versus compelling facts over here. And yet we're still motivated by the story. And yet leaders that are often pitching new ideas will tend to go through all the facts and think it's really a conversation about rational and logic. But why is that it's actually the story is more powerful?
Yeah, so I think you need both. But the reason why the story tends to be critical there is that it turns out humans don't make the rational, logical decisions that we'd like to think we do. And there's a very specific reason for that. And it's that the decisions, it turns out most of our decisions are made in a subconscious emotional processing part of our brain. And then those decisions are justified a few nanoseconds later in a conscious thinking, rational processing part of the brain. So we leave a decision-making process only cognizant of that rational conscious thinking part of the brain. But really the decision was made a few nanoseconds earlier subconsciously, and the rest of our brain is just catching up. So if you want to influence people's opinions, decisions, and behavior, you need to influence both parts of the brain. But we typically, like you said, only talk to that rational, logical thinking part of the brain, and you need to reach both. And storytelling is just uniquely suited to reach the subconscious emotional processing part of the brain, whereas a list of rational and logical facts and arguments and data just don't. They don't ever get over to that other part of the brain.
Yeah. Well, I have another question that could be a bit more challenging. I think you're up for it, though. In today's corporate world, where we've been pretty much encouraged, developed, promoted by excellent left brain thinking that can get to answers quickly, decisiveness, achievement-based, that's the side of the brain that gets exercised quite a bit. Now, you're talking about story, which sounds to me like right brain thinking, which is not a part of the brains that get exercised, almost discouraged in a lot of companies, and has been really since post-industrial age. And so I wonder how accessible it is to those more left brain leaders to venture into, okay, I'm going to turn this into a story. How do I do that? I'm not a right brain thinker.
Yeah, well, welcome to every one of my clients for the last 10 years. Right? I mean, that's exactly what I spend my time doing, is helping people, those left brain leaders like you're talking about, be able to channel that right part of their brain, that right side of their brain. And part of what puts them at ease, Andy, is that I tell them right up front, you don't need to do this all day long. Right? In fact, only 10 to 15% of the words coming out of your mouth as a leader, I think, should be in the form of a story. 10 to 15%.
Yeah.
So 85 to 90% of the conversations you're having are just normal conversations like you and I are having right now. In other words, not involving a story. But, if you do that math, out of a 60-minute, meeting, 6 to 9 minutes of that hour you might spend telling a story. And these stories are, 2 or 3 or 4 minutes each. So you might tell 3-minute stories out of the course of an hour-long meeting with somebody or with a group of people. So it's not all the time. And that gives them some, they can relax. I don't need to completely change the way I lead, but being able to sprinkle in a few of these compelling stories every once in a while will radically change their leadership capability.
Well, it sounds like you would pick your moments for that. I've been around a few leaders that have been maybe long in the tooth, and I'd hear their stories many times, and it seemed like they just settled in on that state. So we kind of resist that sometimes because not really clear what's the appropriate time to use a story. And I would think that the outcome you're trying to achieve in that moment is a real guiding point to say this is a good time for a story to use. How do you assess or guide your clients on, okay, you see this situation, boy, you'll be better served with a story here than probably anything else? How do you know, have you categorized those moments where a story might be the right answer?
Yeah, so this may be the time to get into what stories you need to tell, because part of what I teach leaders is you probably can use storytelling for more leadership purposes than you thought you could. So,
Okay.
most people say, well, I don't want to tell a story unless, the situation calls for it and I've got a good story to tell. And that's exactly right. You shouldn't unless both of those things are true. The situation calls for it and you've got an effective story you can tell. But most leaders, I find, think that that's about 4 or 5 situations in the world where where both those two things are the case, and it's not. There are dozens and dozens of them. I think I called out 22 or 3 of them in my first book, and my most recent book, I tried to focus on fewer actually, just to give people a place to start, and that may be the place for us to go. You want me to share what are the top 10?
Please. I'd love to hear about these. I'm fascinated.
Yeah, so I wanted to, out of the dozens of situations, leadership challenges where leaders could and should be using storytelling. These are, I think, the top 10. And the first 4 go together because they're about setting the direction for the organization. So that's where we came from. So that's a founding story. Why we can't stay there. So that's a case for change story, like we talked about earlier.
Okay.
Where we're going, which is a vision story, and how we're going to get there, which is a strategy story, because a strategy is about how are you going to get from where you are now to where you want to be. So if you imagine as a leader, if you can tell those 4 stories, you can easily articulate where we came from, why we can't stay there, where we're going, and how we're going to get there. The next 4 go together as well, but they're more about who we are as an organization. So that's what we believe. So that's a corporate values story. Who we serve. So that's a customer story, a story about your customer, so that everybody at the organization can have a personal, human, visceral understanding of the customer. What we do for our customers. That's a classical sales story. And how we're different from our competitors. And I call that a marketing story just because I think marketing's job is generally differentiating yourselves, your brand from your competitors. So if you imagine you can tell those 4 stories easily, you can easily articulate, who you are, who you serve, what you do for your customers, and how you're different than your competitors. So if you're keeping track, that's 8. So there's 2 more, right?
Yeah.
So these last 2 are really more personal to you, the leader. So that's why I lead the way I do, personal leadership philosophy story. And why you should want to work here. Not you, but the person you're talking to, right? So that's a recruiting story. And I think that's, those are important because every leader's job is attracting talented people into the organization and getting them to stay and follow your leadership, even if you don't work in recruiting, So again, there are dozens more, but I think if you're just starting out as a leader wanting to stretch your storytelling muscle, those would be the, first 10 stories I would put in your repertoire of stories to tell and be able to tell them when it's time and you recognize the need to tell a case for change story or tell a sales story or a marketing story. You've got one to tell.
The Big Quest podcast with Andy Murray will return right after this break.
Today, more than ever, we need leaders who lead with the values of excellence, professionalism, innovation, and collegiality, which stand for EPIC. These are the values the Walton College of Business consistently demonstrate. I've worked with the Walton College as a business owner or executive for over 25 years, and I can tell you with certainty, the students we've hired, the exec ed programs, and the insights from their research have made an epic impact and continue to inspire me with new ways of thinking. Their vision to bring thought leadership to the challenges business face today, such as business integrity or how to be a customer-centric organization, that adds real value by creating conversations that connect people with organizations, faculty, industry, and practice. I put a link in the show notes to Dean Matt Waller's Be Epic podcast, where you'll hear stories and get great content that will inspire you to be epic.
We now return to the bigQUEST podcast with Andy Murray.
It sounds like all those stories are a connection to heart and minds, not just intellectual stories about, a bumblebee and a wasp or something, but it's got some sense of when you're talking story in these cases, you're talking about something that connects to people emotionally.
Yeah, I'm not sure I understand the bumblebee and wasp thing. Do you have a good bumblebee story that I haven't heard?
Okay, this is like my problem. A lot of my stories don't make sense, and so I am curious on what you might have as an advice on like what is a good story. Because if I sat down and wrote all 10 and they all started with "Once Upon a Time," I would need some help, and so that is not where I'm at. So I would love to know like
some tips on how to craft these stories.
I would want all 10 of them to be the lame or the same format. I any guidance on how to get started doing it well?
Yeah. So interesting you say format. And let me tell you a story. So first of all, that's the wrong way to start a story. Never start a story by saying, let me tell you a story. And the reason is because I think 60 or 70% of adults, when they hear those words at work, oh, their eyes roll in the back of their head and they're like, oh, seriously? Like, we're busy. Can you just tell us what you want us to know? Like, uh, adults at work don't think they want to hear stories. But if you tell them a story and it's a good story, they'll love it and it'll be impactful and powerful. But don't ruin it by telling them, it's going to sound like you're a kindergarten teacher, right? Well, gather around, boys and girls. It's story time. Like, grown-ups don't want to hear that, right? I'm not even sure kids.
This is really good advice, Paul. Ben, are you paying attention? You've got Ben was a creative director at Y&R, so it's like massive storyteller. And this is the first time I've heard, don't start a story by saying, let me tell you a story.
But there is a format that you should follow, and you should follow it every time. And your stories will not sound the same, even though you're following the same format, because the characters in the story, the plot line, all that stuff is going to be different because it's a totally different story. But the format or the structure of the story should be the same. And that is what helps you tell an interesting, engaging, understandable story that doesn't meander and is short. Okay. And the way you do that is you answer 8 questions, only 8 questions, and you answer them in a particular order. All right. So I'm going to give you the 8 questions right now. First of all,
I'm ready.
Why should I bother listening to the story? Yeah. You going to write this down? Okay. I'll send it to you. So why should I bother listening to the story?
Put those in the link. I mean, this is in one of your books, right?
But it's in a couple of them. But yeah, I'd be happy to send them to you. You can put a link for the your viewers. So the first one is, why should I bother listening to the story? Right? You've got to answer that question in the first, 10 or 15 seconds, or they might not listen to your story, right? They might mentally, physically, or emotionally walk away from your story. So you got to give them a reason to want to listen to you for the next 2 or 3 minutes. Once you've done that, you've earned the right to answer the next 5 questions. Where and when did it take place? Who's the main character and what did they want? What was the problem or opportunity they ran into? What did they do about it? And how did it turn out in the end? Right, and that should sound like the natural flow of a story, right? Because it is the natural flow of a story.
Right.
But there are 2 left, right? If you're keeping track. So 7 and 8. So the last 2 questions are, what did you learn from the story? And what do you think I should go do now? I the person you're telling the story to. So that's your opportunity to make a recommendation based on the story.
I love that.
That's how you tie it into a business objective.
Yeah, that last bit is really clever. I mean, because that brings it into, why am I telling you this story, right?
Exactly. Now, interestingly though, Andy, you as the storyteller only answer questions 1 through 6. What you want is for the audience to answer questions 7 or 8, right? And the reason is because people are more passionate about pursuing their own ideas than they are about pursuing your ideas, right? So part of the benefit of telling a story is that it becomes their idea. You tell them a story and they're like, oh, well, I think I'm going to go do this now. That's their idea, which they're more likely to go do than if you just boss them around and tell them to go do X, Y, or Z.
I love it. I love it. And their imagination kicks in to fill in the story with how they would imagine it. That's brilliant. Yeah, keep going. This is good.
Yeah. So, all right. So you're not saying, let me tell you a story. You're answering these 8 questions, or at least the first 6, and then you pause and give the story a chance to work, see how your audience responds. And normally they'll tell you what they thought of the story and what the lesson they learned and what they're going to go do now. And if they get the right answer, good, your job's done, right? It's like, what do they tell us in sales, Andy? When the buyer says yes, like, shut up and go home, right?
Go home,
nothing you can do after that is going to help, right? So yeah, so if they say the right thing, good, you're done. Now, if they learn the wrong lesson, then you can always redirect them, right? You can, that's an interesting conclusion. I thought of that too, but I came to a different conclusion, and here's why.
That's very diplomatic way of saying you didn't get the story.
Exactly. Yeah.
Really
So,
I like that.
Structure is important.
So how often do you recommend throwing a curveball in the story, meaning it's not the ending they thought it would be? Does that throw people off, or does that actually make them think even more?
Now, as often as you can is the answer to that question.
Really? Okay.
So, yeah, it's not always possible, but there are some techniques that you can use that work almost all the time. So to create a surprise ending, that's what you're talking about. And a surprise ending.
Yeah, that's what I'm talking about. It's like, I didn't see that coming kind of story.
Yeah, and that's important for maybe a surprising reason, ironically. So in a movie you watch or a book you're reading, we love surprise endings just because it's fun. And
That's
it
right.
is the same thing for your business stories as well, but it does something more important, is it makes the story more memorable and the lesson at the end of it more memorable. And the reason is because when somebody is surprised, there's a little bit of a release of adrenaline in their system, right? That's what surprise does in the human body. Physiologically, adrenaline gets released in your system. It's been scientifically proven that adrenaline enhances your memory consolidation process, so your memory formation. So
Did not know
literally,
that.
adrenaline makes whatever's happening more memorable, and you want your story to be more memorable, especially the end where the lesson is. So a surprise ending actually plays a practical role in a business or leadership story, and you can create one in almost any story with this technique. So I'll illustrate it for you. So there's
Please do.
so a young boy named James, 9-year-old kid. He's in the kitchen with his mom and his mom's sister. While mom and auntie are sitting at the kitchen table having a cup of tea, James is standing at the stove watching the tea kettle boil. And he's just fascinated with it, right? He's watching the jet of steam come out of the top of the kettle, and he's got a little spoon. He holds it up there into the jet of steam, and he's watching as drops of water condense on the spoon, and they trickle down and they drip into a cup that he's got sitting out there just, for that purpose. And he's watching the cycle go over and over and over again, just fascinated with it. Well, eventually his mother just gets, frustrated with him, and she yells at him. She's like, James, go do your homework, ride your bike, read a book. like, aren't you ashamed of yourself just wasting your time staring at the tea kettle boiling for an hour now? Well, fortunately, young James was undaunted by his mother's admonition, because 20 years later, at the age of 29, of course, and in the year 1765, James Watt reinvented the steam engine, ushering in the Industrial Revolution that we, of course, all benefit from today, and all based on that fascination with steam that he developed at the age of 9 in his mother's kitchen. Now, I can tell by the look on your face that you didn't see that coming, right?
No, I did not.
When I first read that story, it was in a book titled James Watt. It was a book about the inventor of the steam engine. So, of course, it was no surprise to me that the 9-year-old kid in chapter 1 was James Watt. It was a surprise to you for this very simple reason. I didn't tell you his last name, right?
No.
I didn't answer a question that belonged at the beginning of the story. Question number 3 is, who's the main character? I'm supposed to answer that question at the beginning of the story. The human brain expects that answer at the beginning of the story. And I only partially answered it and didn't give you the full answer until the end. Presto.
I love it.
Surprise ending. You can do it with almost anything.
That's actually a fair, now that you've explained it, that's a fairly simple mechanic that you can invent to create a surprise if you don't know the plot line on how to create a surprise. You know what I'm saying? If like I could do that. I could leave that part out of an expected story and put it in at the end, and all of a sudden now I'm a storyteller that creates surprise. But it's just that one device of what you expect to get at the front, save it for the end. That's brilliant. Any other kind of hacks like that would serve to help you build great stories? That's a good one.
Yeah. So, there are other things you need to do. Like, you need to have emotional engagement in a story. And so, some of the techniques to create that emotional engagement are dialogue. That's a simple one. If all your stories were, the company did this, and then the company did that, and then the company did this, well, that's not a story. That's a case study, right? That's an HBR case study. Yeah. But if Bob did this, and then Sally said that, and then Bob said this, but well, now the dialogue makes it an interesting story, and you care about people more. So, dialogue is one of those things. Yeah. Putting in anything that has some emotional resonance to the audience, that they will care about, will of course make you care about your story more. So there are little techniques like that too that create the right emotional engagement.
Well, one of the things I like about story, after spending 4 years in the UK and just getting back, many are brilliant storytellers, and story is part of the culture there. And then for me, having worked with diverse groups, the diversity is so important to get understanding of stories. And so, is there anything cultural that would hold you back, or be maybe a handicap to telling good stories? Or because for me, I found culturally storytelling is pretty universal across cultures. It's not something that, well, if I use this story, this culture doesn't even tell stories. I've not seen a culture yet that doesn't use stories. So I'm
curious to the relatedness of storytelling in a diverse and inclusive culture. My hypothesis is it gets richer if the whole team learns how to tell stories, because you're pulling in such personal connections to people. It's revealing a bit of yourself.
Yeah, I agree. I have not met a culture where storytelling is not used or not important at all. I have noticed a difference in the degree of importance and the acceptable amount of time to invest in conversations. That percentage, that 10 to 15% I gave you, I've seen a spectrum of that. And, and for example, and this maybe won't surprise you, in Latin America, that number is bigger. In Germany, that number is smaller. In the U.S., that number is somewhere in the. That's kind of where I came up with the number. I live and work mostly in the U.S. But so there's a spectrum. But I've yet to and I work with people all over the world. I've yet to work with a group where that number is zero. Right? It's always 5, 10, 15, 20. Yeah. Yeah. In fact, I had one of my clients in Latin America tell me that, in a typical sales call that she would go on, she had an hour, 15 to 20 minutes of the hour. So that's 33%. She would spend just trading personal stories with the buyer. And that's the way they bonded, just in a human way, relationship building. And then the remaining 40 minutes, there might be a handful of other stories. She would tell more professional stories. So it could be 40% or 50% in some cultures, but I don't think zero ever happens.
Well, I can tell you one thing in my experience from working with Procter, Walmart, and in the agency business, the people at the dinner table that were really good at storytelling just commanded attention. And almost every senior leader, the more senior they got, would use a story to communicate. When Doug McMillan would come and speak to an audience, he often would use a story, every time, use stories. And I would say it's 80% stories of what he saw, what he believed, telling a story of an associate's heroics. But he always seemed to tie it to reinforcing a value that he cared about, or a statement that, something he was concerned about. So if it's gratefulness or commitment, no matter what was on his mind, there seemed to have a story in there somewhere that was going to come out to reinforce that, because of the memorability of that story to do that. So I wish that our culture and our professional environments would put more energy toward it. And you're obviously getting quite a bit of energy toward you, because you're making a living teaching people how to do it. But where is the demand curve right now for this? Because I feel like we'll have a much better life and working environment if we got out of our spreadsheets a bit and became a bit more human in the way we talk to each other. What do you think?
Yeah, I agree. In fact, that type of storytelling that you're referring to, that's number 5 on that list of 10 I gave you. That's a what we believe story of values. What do we value? What are our ethics? What are our, what do we believe? So it's a very, very important type of story. Where the demand curve on this is, it continues to grow. I think 30 years ago, the demand for this would have been very, very low. Probably around 30 years ago, before 30 years ago, it was low. Around 30 years ago, there was a renaissance, if you will, in storytelling in the professional ranks, and with a few books that were written at the time and that have continued to be published in that space. And I think it's for the last 3 decades, it's been growing rapidly. So, and I don't see it slowing down anytime soon. I mean, COVID lockdowns notwithstanding, we've all moved online. So I just see it becoming more important. I don't see it becoming less important anytime soon.
No, and in some parts of a company are different than others. I know at P&G, when I first started, I worked on a multifunctional team that was trying to create a customer service offering for the food division. And the guys that were just so interesting to hang out with were the sales guys. And for some reason, they were much more clever at storytelling than us poor engineering IT guys. We had the worst stories. But it's good to know we could learn and improve. I mean, there's hope for everybody on that. But I think that was their profession, when you're dealing with people, being good at storytelling. I don't know if your experience at P&G was that, where there's somehow these guys were all a collection of gifted storytellers, but you couldn't really survive as a top leader in sales at P&G without knowing the craft of storytelling.
I agree. But interestingly, about half of my clients now are sales teams. So
really?
It's ironic that they are it's a bunch of people who are probably naturally more gifted in storytelling, like you're saying, than your average person from some other function. But they also know that in their job, it's more important than any other function to be very, very good at it. And so they invest in that skill set. So yeah, I'd say about half of my clients now are that. And part of it is they need to learn, just like a leader does, the breadth of stories that they could and should be telling at work. And again, it's a lot more than they probably thought. And my third book is Sell with a Story, specifically for salespeople. And I documented 25 different types of specifically sales stories that great salespeople are telling all over the world. And if you ask a salesperson, they go, I got 3 good go-to stories. Well, probably not enough. You probably need some more.
Yeah. I probably have heard 2 of them because you get those tend to be repeated. Talk about a little bit, Paul, around taking story down a notch. I know there's a line there between story and message. And one of the things that I feel is helpful in trying to create a movement or a big quest is when you've got this visual value proposition. And whether it is we're going to fight hunger, create change, or we're going to put a playground in every postcode is what we used in the UK. Those communicated in themselves a whole message and they're very short, but they could be broadened into a story. I think of Bill Simon when he's launching the prescription program at Walmart, $4 generics. And he could have said, we're going to transform healthcare, or we're going to do something, but just that really clear A to B. And he's creating an A to B journey in that story. My assumption is if you get good at storytelling, your brain's going to think probably in different ways about how to use language that's helpful, even in those visual metaphors that you create. I suppose. Have you found any of that in your research to be true?
Yes. Storytelling is an art. Right? It's not a science. Okay. And so like any other art, some people are going to be born a little bit better at it than others. And some of us aren't, but just like any other form of art, it's learnable. Just because you can't play the guitar doesn't mean you'd never be able to play the guitar, right? You take lessons from somebody who knows and you can learn. I think what you're talking about is those catchphrases or taglines or
Tom Muccio was the king of it. If you've worked with Tom Muccio would be the king of that at P&G, right? All the reverse bow tie completely changed an industry.
Right.
But that's exactly what I'm talking about. Go ahead. Sorry to cut you off.
Well, I mean, those things are important too. They're not stories, right? At least not the definition that I use. It's not a narrative about something that happened to somebody. But again, remember, only 10 to 15% of your communication should be these stories. You need these kind of monikers and taglines and vision statements and mission statements and OGSMs, we used to call them, your strategy documents, right? Yeah. You need all of those too. That's the other 80, 85, 90% of the words that you're saying. You need these stories to go along with it. So just because you're a good storyteller doesn't necessarily mean you're going to be good at those other things either. But it like any good art, it will stretch a part of your brain that you probably haven't been exercising. And so it would surprise me if you got better at some of those other things as well.
Yeah, that's exactly where I was going, because you're using your right brain muscles, you're exercising them, you're creating those stories. Any advice to someone that's just starting out, they've listening to this perhaps, and they've been a bit more of a left brain. They're definitely going to go read your book. So I think they got that. But then, but any kind of things that you would recommend every single day? Because I'm a big believer in find one thing that will move you toward your goal and do it every single day. How can it become a habit or practice? Is there one habit or practice that you say, you do this every single day, you are going to get better at this and better at?
Well, and given the conversation we're having, I guess I would have to say tell at least one story a day. I mean, if you spend 8 hours at work, and if you use my 10 or 15% rule, you should be telling several, right? But if you're not telling any, you're probably not getting any better. But what that means is you're going to need to start developing a repertoire of stories, like, arrows in your quiver. Otherwise, you're telling the same story over and over and over again. So I think, developing a new story, maybe not every day, but once a week, developing a new story, notice something interesting that happens at work. And if it moved you in some way, it'll move other people when you share it with them. So I'd say maybe once a week, develop a habit of developing a new story And every day, find at least one opportunity to share one of the many stories you have in a moment that it's going to be meaningful. And that way, when it's really, really important, when you're on stage in front of a bunch of people, or you're in that buyer's
Right.
office, or, you're in front of the board of directors or whatever, and you need that really good story, you've had some practice telling some stories, and this won't be your first rodeo, right?
How do you address someone that might be saying, I'm not a good storyteller. I have a great story, but I get stage fright, or I'm not sure I'm good at delivery. Any kind of thoughts on how to help someone present a good story in a way that may help them improve their skills? Because I gotta believe the skill of it is one thing. It's different than the actual content of the story. Let's say you're past the content, you got a great story idea, but you're just not confident, and you almost tell it and you then tie your shoes because you're worried that they're going to laugh at you or something.
Yeah. So Andy, I think what you're talking about is the difference between crafting a story and then delivering the story. And the first thing I guess I would say to you is that the story really is more important than the delivery. And I know the problem you're talking about, because I see it all the time with the people that I'm coaching. They'll be in a conversation with 10, 15 people around a conference room, and they're talking and they're perfectly comfortable talking in front of their peers. But the moment they want to tell a story, they get nervous. And okay, so I'm going to tell you the story now. And they just, it becomes a production, and they're nervous. And the reason is that they're thinking about a story like some actor on stage, and they're putting all this pressure on themselves to deliver the story well. And the truth is, unless you're a professional actor or a professional speaker like me, nobody really expects you to deliver a story any better than you mumble out the stuff that you're saying the rest of the time, right? So just take that pressure off of yourself. So the story is more important than the delivery. In fact, I would go further and tell you that if you tell a helpful story, but you butcher that surprise ending, and you stutter and stammer a little bit, and you don't make good eye contact, and you kind of fidget with your hands a little bit, your audience will forgive you. Because your audience is just people you work with sitting around a conference room, right? Now, if you're on stage at a TEDx event or something, then, maybe that's a little different. But for just normal everyday stuff, your audience will forgive you because you told them a story that is helpful to them and motivating them. But if you tell them a boring, irrelevant story that does not help them, but you deliver it in a way that would make a Shakespearean actor proud, they will never forgive you for wasting their time. Okay. The story is more important than the delivery. So first of all, just
that is great.
Don't put that pressure on yourself.
I would think most people would be thinking the opposite, that I've got to deliver this really well for it to work. So when you do your workshops, I'm not trying to oversell your workshops or raise the bar too high, but do you get into delivery as well as development? Crafting?
Yeah, a little bit. After I make that point, that relieve yourself of that pressure, because that's what will make you mess up, is all that pressure. So it's not as important as the story. But of course, there are some things that you can do to make the delivery better. And we'll cover a few of those things. But using a dialogue is one of those things that makes the delivery. It's easier to say what people say. The number in writing, if you're going to deliver your story in writing, in a letter or on a web page or in a piece of direct mail or something, there are techniques you can use to make it sound more like a story. And it's basically shorter sentences and smaller words, right? You want your written story to sound conversational instead of written like it was something written to be read, right? People speak in sentences differently than they write in sentences. And so we cover some of the distinctions between those two things. And even if you're going to write your story, you want it to be written like it was spoken. In fact, that's my overall advice on delivery in writing, is write the way you'd like to speak. If you were speaking at your best, write that way. Don't speak like you'd like to write. Write the way you'd like to speak.
Yeah, that's interesting. I've written talks and then put them in a teleprompter, and when I practiced, is like, this sounds horrible.
Yes,
right. And
it sounds like you're reading to them, and nobody wants to be read to.
Right. Yeah. Oh, that's great. So, Paul, what's next for you as you continue down this journey? You've made a few pivots to broaden and expand the way you look at it. What's coming down the pike for you?
Well, my goal is to have another book every a couple of years, and I've been at this for 8 or 9 years now, and my 5th book just came out not too long ago. So I'm on path. We would have called it, my initiative pipeline is continuing to deliver.
Very PG thing to say.
Exactly. But the big pivot this year, of course, was because of, COVID-19. All of my speaking engagements had to, transition to online like this. So I had to make some investments in, equipment and studio and learning all kinds of new software and creating a lot of virtual assets now. So I had to basically create a bunch of online video training programs that my clients can access without having me in a room with them. So that took a few months of time and effort that I would have probably spent working on another book. But so that hasn't happened yet because, I'm working on this pivot right now. But yeah, eventually I'll get back into to writing something.
If you had to turn 2020 as a year into a story, I'm not trying to put the master on display here, but or to the test. But I mean, you just made me think about that because how am I going to tell this story of 2020 and make any sense out of it? But I just love to hear your reaction to the year 2020 as a story.
Gosh, I don't know, but it would probably involve a dumpster fire on the deck of that Titanic that's sinking or something. I don't know. Every bad metaphor you could imagine would probably be involved in it. If one good thing comes out of this year, it might be that we all just have better stories to tell about, we can tell our grandkids, oh yeah, and you remember in 2020 when we didn't have any toilet paper and there was no food at the grocery store and daddy didn't work for 6 months and, we're going to have all that. Yeah, we just stocked up on stories this year. That's all we've done.
Well, Paul, I can't tell you how much I appreciate what you're doing. I've read your books. I've used the thoughts, and I've seen it in action. I've seen so many good leaders lead with a story that's changed the outcome or the trajectory or the belief system that someone might have that could be holding them back. And so in this day and age of Twitter and everything's in short sound bites, it makes me appreciate a great story even more as a power to influence change. And so that's what we're all about here. And thank you for taking the time to be on this with us.
Yeah, I appreciate the time. It's always good getting to catch up with you.
Thanks for listening to the bigQUEST podcast with Andy Murray. Make sure to head over to bigQUEST.com to download our free checklist to launch your own bigQUEST. On the website, you'll find resources and ideas around the method, mindset, and motivation concepts behind the bigQUEST framework. If you like this episode, make sure to subscribe and leave a comment. We'd love to hear what resonated with you today. And if you want to share this podcast, we're available on Apple Podcasts, Stitcher Radio, Spotify, Google Play, and anywhere you listen to audio. Our goal with this podcast is to help passionate leaders think differently and make meaningful change. Be sure to subscribe so you'll be notified when the next episode goes live. Until next time, I'm Ben Ortlip here with Andy Murray, reminding you to think big and quest on.